Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Social Work England session, which is called Responding to the Challenges in Practice where there are concerns of child sexual abuse in the family environment. My name is Gavin Morgan. I'm a social worker and I work for Social Work England. I'm really pleased to be welcoming our speaker today, Anna Glinski. Before we make a start, though, I'd just like to talk you through a few key points. First of all, privacy. Your privacy is very important to us, and you have provided us with personal information to enable you to join this session. And please be assured that we will only use your information for the purposes of which you've agreed to them being used for. And there's also a legal disclaimer here in that we have had and we will continue to have a number of third parties who are presenting to these Social Work England events. We haven't endorsed third-party content, so we don't accept liability for the content of third-party information. I think in particularly considering the content, not just of our information generally, which you've had across Social Work Week, but perhaps in relation to this event, as much as more than any, we have to appreciate that we deal with some quite strong subject areas in social work, which can create triggers for some people. So please be mindful of this and take whatever steps you need to look after yourself. But without further ado, I'm now going to pass on to our speaker, Anna Glinski. Anna, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Gavin, for that introduction. And good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to join this session. I am really delighted to be here today during Social Work Week, firstly, but also to talk about an area of practice I feel particularly passionate about. So I qualified as a social worker in 2001 and have increasingly specialised in child sexual abuse work since that time. Prior to joining the CSA Centre, where I now work, in 2017, I worked for 16 years in local authority children's social care as a social worker, social work manager, and I was instrumental in setting up an in-house specialist multidisciplinary service for any family affected by child sexual abuse. And as part of that, I was an expert witness in court on child sexual abuse cases. It was during this period within the local authority that I saw the way in which children, young people and adults and their families actually are silenced not just by their experience of sexual abuse, but by the system that should be protecting and supporting them. And what I could see is that while sexual abuse can feel complex and emotional and actually a little bit scary, there are just so many things that we can all do, particularly as social workers, to make a really significant difference to children, young people and adults and families that we work with. What we need to do is just learn what that is and be brave enough to do it. And so today I want to focus partly and towards the end of the session on that learning bit. So what is it that we need to do with social work education to make sure that we are skilled enough to do this work? I've spent the last 7 years in a role at this place trying to persuade those with the power to change social work education really, to understand that actually unless we start teaching social workers about child sexual abuse, we will continue not to be able to support victims and survivors in the way that we should. And yet with just some teaching, we could radically change our identification and response to child sexual abuse. So I'm talking to you today about the National Panel Report findings and recommendations, what feels to me to be a landmark moment really in recognising the need for professional development on child sexual abuse. I hope that by the end of this session, you too recognise the vital importance of this and have some ideas about how social work education can achieve it so that we, as social workers, play the rightful role we should be playing to improve the lives of victims and survivors. Okay, so I am hoping we will have time for questions. I'm a bit terrible for jabbering on, but we shall see how we go. Let me just very briefly, and I think Ellie is going to post a link to our organisation in the chat, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I work at the Centre of Expertise on Child Sexual Abuse, set up in 2017, mostly funded by the Home Office, but we have other funding. And we're a team of people working across practice, research, policy, and we all work together to try and improve the professional response to child sexual abuse. So all of our resources are free, they're written by practitioners for practitioners, and I'll introduce you to some of those as we go through the session. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the scale and nature of child sexual abuse, just to set the context, then talk about the report, the National Panel Report, then think about some of the challenges in practice, and then at the end, what does this mean for social work education? Gavin's already touched on this, but just to say that, we know sexual abuse affects an awful lot of people. It can be difficult to think about and talk about, and actually that can affect us differently at different times and in different ways. And you may well have decided that you felt this was an okay session to do today, and then you might decide it isn't, and that's fine. Some of the content we're going to be covering will be a bit difficult to listen to, and there's not a lot of detail, but still hearing the panel findings are hard. So just be aware of the experience, your own feelings and experiences. Be kind to yourself. So sometimes what happens is when we hear information or we learn something new about an area of practice, we can end up kind of thinking, I didn't do that. I let a child down, or I let a family down previously. And actually, this is about learning and moving forward and recognising, actually, because we have had no teaching on this area, really, no standard teaching on this area, that there will be mistakes that have been made, but this is about moving forward and doing things differently. Respect each other's learning journey. There, if we do get to questions, there's no such thing as a stupid question. We can get a bit walking on eggshells with sexual abuse, and that's not helpful at all. So, okay. So I'm just going to start with this quote from Simon, who's a care leaver. Some years ago, while I was undertaking a file audit on neglect in the local authority I worked in, I read through the case files of Simon. So Simon was a child who'd been removed from his family of origin on the basis of years and years of neglect and placed in foster care with his younger brother. The case chronology showed a catalogue of concerns about sexual abuse. So there were inappropriate people coming in and out of the home, instances of sexualised behaviour, indicators of emotional distress, no bedroom and bathroom doors, all lack of boundaries, lack of privacy. And it was very clear from the notes, actually, that social workers and other professionals had been repeatedly concerned over years about whether these two boys were being sexually abused in the family. And yet each episode concluded with the concerns weren't evidenced because the boys hadn't made a disclosure. They hadn't reported what was going on for them. So some years later, Simon requested access to his records and confirmed years and years of sexual abuse at the hands of more than one family member. Okay, and the worker said to him, well, why didn't you tell anyone? And he very simply said, and why did nobody ask me? This is the fundamental problem we have with child sexual abuse, and secrecy is the best friend of sexual abuse. And what we do by not talking about it and not naming it and not doing that is we collude with the people who are abusing the children, because the people who are abusing the children absolutely depend on us not talking about it, not recording it, not naming it, all those kind of things. I'm going to give you another case example to start us off as well. So this is a quote from a survivor, age 41. I don't know why it started, I don't know why it stopped, and I still don't know really, because no one ever spoke with me about it. So this woman had been sexually abused from the age of 3 to about 12 by a maternal uncle. She didn't tell anyone during that period of time. When she was 12, another child in the family reported abuse by the same man. Her mum said to her, has he also abused you? She said, yes. And that was it. She was made safe, actually, but there was no further discussion with her about how it had happened, why it had happened, that it wasn't her fault, that it wasn't her responsibility. So she runs into difficulties at school. Now, school knew she'd been sexually abused, but they didn't like to mention it. They referred her to child and adolescent mental health services, who also knew she'd been abused, but again, didn't really like to mention it. It was for the child to tell them. She ended up in adult substance misuse and mental health services. They still didn't ask about it because actually they were dealing with the presenting issue, not the root causes of those issues. And then she came to the attention of children's services when her own child was sexually abused, where we asked the question. So there was 30 years of opportunities where any one of us as professionals and as social workers could have just at the very least said to her, you do know this wasn't your fault. Those opportunities that weren't taken. So then she sits with all of this time, with all of the kind of, the core kind of the core aim of grooming a child is about giving the child responsibility for what's happened to them. And if we as adults and as professionals don't challenge that rhetoric, then that rhetoric from the person abusing the child remains in that person's head without challenge. And that is about, this is your fault, this is your responsibility, you took the toy, you took the gift, you wanted it, all of that kind of stuff. And that's the bit that we miss when we think that we can't talk about these things. Okay, so Essentially, we're being held back. As professionals, we're held back by silence and fear. There's a lot of fear involved in this, but we'll touch on, and also this real lack of knowledge. So actually, we haven't got anyone giving us the kind of right information about this stuff. And what we need to move to is a situation where we are communicating with each other, with children, with families, with adults. We have hope and courage, and we know what we're doing. So what do we actually know from the data? Overall, so when you look at all the kind of surveys, essentially more than 1 in 10 children, this is what the data says, and this will be a conservative estimate, 1 in 10 children have been sexually abused by the age of 16 across England and Wales. Now, this is much higher for girls than boys, as you can see on the screen. So 15% of girls, 5% of boys. What I want to just highlight is that very often when we look at data on child sexual abuse, the boys come up lower than the girls. And actually what that can make us do is to kind of not think about boys as victims or not worry about boys so much. 5% of boys is a lot of boys, okay? So there are more girls, and it is a gendered crime in a lot of ways. So the majority of people who abuse children are male. But that doesn't mean that females don't abuse, and it also doesn't mean that boys, are abused. What's really interesting, so when you look at the crime survey data, so the data that, so adults reporting their experiences as children, what we can see when we look at the kind of the different factors they've experienced is that children who live in conditions of neglect are 5 times more likely to experience sexual abuse. So just have a think about the kind of families that you work with where neglect is an issue, and how many of them actually are you noticing that there's also sexual abuse. Children who spend time in residential care are 4 times more likely. Now, we don't know whether that's happened before they've come into care or after they've come into care, but it's still something for us to really think about. How often are we having these conversations with young people? And disabled children at least twice as likely as non-disabled children to be targeted. Now, other data indicates that that's actually up to 3 or 4 times more likely to experience abuse. But again, how many of you who work in Children's Disability Service or disabled children's teams, how many of those children are on child in need plans or child protection plans for sexual abuse? Very few, I imagine. And also what we can see is that actually children who live in a household with people misusing drugs or alcohol, and it's actually similar for mental health, 3 times more likely to experience sexual abuse. And over half of the children who are sexually abused also experience other forms of abuse separate to the sexual abuse. So also emotional abuse or witnessing domestic abuse. Now, I just want to kind of centre, although I'm going to be talking to you about the National Panel Report, which was into intrafamilial child sexual abuse, what I want to just highlight is we have been very siloed in our approach to sexual abuse. And actually what we know is over the last kind of few years, particularly sort of 10 years ago, there was a very necessary focus on child sexual exploitation, so abuse outside of the family. But actually that forms a very small part of overall abuse, and sexual exploitation is also a form of child sexual abuse. And at one point, when we looked at like 90% of local authorities had action plans and strategies in relation to sexual exploitation, and 4% had a strategy or action plan on child sexual abuse more broadly. Now we need to see that all of these types of sexual abuse cross over with one another. So the ICSA inquiry, the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, 6,500 victims and survivors gave evidence as part of the Truth Project, and they were people who had been sexually abused in institutions. Just under half of them had previously experienced abuse in the family home. There was some research in Wales where they looked at 10 years worth of 100 children's services files of children who were being sexually exploited. Just under half of them had previously experienced sexual abuse in the family home or rape prior to the age of 16. When you look at, and so these are the same children, and actually in not recognising that child sexual abuse is linked to child sexual exploitation, we are really missing a trick, because actually if a child is being sexually exploited and we are not considering the way that they were traumatically sexualised as children, then how are we going to support children to move forward? And the other point I just want to mention here is on this bottom box here, so child sexual abuse through viewing, sharing, or the online type child sexual abuse. Again, we've done a similar thing. And what's fascinating with this area, I think, is, some time ago, a few years back, although we still kind of slot into this thinking, but it was all about stranger danger. And then we realised, actually, you're much more likely to be abused by somebody you know, okay? Much, much more likely. Very stranger sexual abuse, very, very rare. So we realised actually this isn't about strangers, this is about people we know. And we've kind of done the same thing with the online world. So we started with all this saying, beware of the strangers contacting you online, the people that are liking you or friending you, or they'll all be strangers. Actually, what the research is now saying is the majority of children who are experienced online are abused by people that they know. Around about half of those involves family members or someone within the family network. And when we look at the indecent images, so what do the indecent images of children look like that are online? Around about half of them are filmed in familial settings. So we can't be separating out these different things. We need to be thinking very kind of broadly about, if there is one bit of sexual abuse, let's think about all the other kind of areas, really. So the most common context, I've touched on the fact that sexual exploitation is a small and important but very small part of the overall picture. The majority of children overall are abused in the family environment. And actually, when you break that down by gender, for girls, abuse by the family members is more common, and for boys, abuse by authority figures is more common. This is our iceberg infographic. If you ever all of the infographics I'll show you are available free online. So if you're doing presentations or anything, you please do go ahead and use them. What this graph shows you is the majority of sexual abuse isn't being identified by statutory services. So survey data shows around 500,000 children under the age of 16 are sexually abused every year in England and Wales. Out of those that kind of reach statutory attention, so 101,000 child sexual abuse offences, so not children but offences, are reported to the police. So that's a significant reduction from what we know is going on. 45,000 children are assessed at risk of sexual abuse by children's social care, so a big drop from the 500,000. 10,500 children are seen by a sexual assault referral centre. 2,200 children are on a child protection plan due to child sexual abuse. This is the lowest, this data came out last week, it's the lowest level in 30 years. Since record began, it's the lowest level in 30 years in terms of children on child protection plans for sexual abuse. It's something that we really need to worry about and think about. Now, what this graph shows you about, so is on the left-hand side on the top is what adults reported were happening to them as children, and what you can see that sexual abuse comes up, same as physical abuse, a bit lower than emotional abuse, but essentially just as common as other forms of child abuse. And yet, if we look at the number of assessments on the graph below, you see that sexual abuse drops right down. Now, on the right, what we can see is this massive increase in registrations around neglect and emotional abuse, and this decline in sexual abuse down to the number now 2,160, so just under that. So that's reduced by nearly 2/3 over the last 30 years. It certainly isn't that there is less child sexual abuse, okay? Now, it's a bit of a crude measure in terms of looking at plans, but actually this significant decline means that we're not only not talking about it with children and families and each other, we're also not recording it. And if we don't record concerns about child sexual abuse, then we're not going to have recommendations that meet those concerns. And this is just in terms of police reporting. So what this graph shows you on the left, you can see this massive increase of reporting to police around sexual abuse that's happened over the last few years. Some of that was about non-recent reporting after the Savile effect, we called it, but most of this is about new reporting. So there's been this big increase in reporting to police, and yet the number of charges has remained level. So the line across the bottom is the number of charges that are brought as a result of the offences. There's been a slight increase this year, which is positive, but essentially it has remained level. And the time it takes from charge to offence, so from offence to charge, sorry, you can see here 201 days, and from charge to completion at court 260 days, so nearly a whole year average. So there will be cases that take much longer and there'll be cases that take much shorter, but on average this is how long children are waiting, usually during a period where everyone's saying, well, don't speak to the child because we might disrupt the investigation. So these children are left with their own thoughts and the voice of the people that have harmed them in their head. And also it's a bit of a postcode lottery. So when we look across the country, you can see that there's a massive difference for no reason, no matter which way you cut the data, you can't work this out, a difference between the number of offences that are reported and the number of children where they're named in assessments, masses of variation across the country. This is our Data Insights Hub. It's a fairly new publication. What you can do is type in your local authority area and it will give you all of your data. So you'll have an iceberg for your own area, your number of children on plans, how you compare to statistical neighbours and all that kind of stuff. So please try not to have a play now because you can get quite absorbed in it. But after the session, please do have a look, and you can then use that data to kind of look at your own area and what needs to change in your own kind of practice. So what we have seen across a number of inspections and reviews and inquiries is that essentially professionals haven't been given, and this has come up repeatedly over time, professionals haven't been given the knowledge and skills to confidently respond to child sexual abuse. It's a difficult area of practice. We rely far too heavily on children to verbally disclose, and we'll look a bit more about that in a bit. And we have a real over-reliance on the criminal justice system as a means of assessing whether abuse happened or not. So in many ways, this report has come up with the same findings. Okay, so that these are issues that have been in practice for a long time, and actually what this report did was kind of highlight, you know, similar stuff really. So this is the national panel report. I wanted them all to notice. It was commissioned by the Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel because of the practice they were seeing in the rapid reviews that were coming into them, the rapid reviews and LCSBRs. Not so much about the number of them, interestingly, but about the kind of very poor practice, and they were thinking, what is going on here? So we were commissioned to do this piece of work. Delighted. I've been obviously working in intrafamilial child sexual abuse for a long time, and I was just so pleased to have the opportunity to kind of do this piece of research, and our team worked on this report. So this is what we did in terms of the research. So we looked at 136 rapid reviews and 40 of the LSCPRs that involved 193 children. We looked at all the recent research and practice guidance around intrafamilial child sexual abuse. We did 10 online reflective discussions with 107 practitioners who had worked on the reviews that we were looking at. We did 2 face-to-face interviews with young people. We had wanted to do many more. We had been through ethics committee to do many more. We had a rigorous process to do that, and we couldn't get past business managers and some social workers and social work managers to get to the children, which in itself is absolutely fascinating. If we are going to improve the lot of children, if we're going to give them a voice in terms of sexual abuse, it is often our fears that, like, don't talk to them, we're going to traumatise them. They've already been traumatised by the sexual abuse. We can talk to them in a way that is trauma-informed. The 2 that we did get to said, I'm so pleased to be part of this review. One of them, by the way, didn't know there'd even been a review on her. They said, I'm so pleased because I feel like I can help others. And part of people's recovery is about contributing. And we can be very, you know, our concern about raising something difficult with both children and adults, perhaps something they've already experienced, is, I think, disproportionate. We actually managed to see more of the people in prison for offending these children, and believe me, the process of doing that is a nightmare. So we interviewed 5 of the offenders, 1 woman and 4 men, and we then had roundtable discussions with different groups of professionals, government departments, the inspectorates, to really try and think, how do we get on top of this problem, and help us think about the recommendations. So the findings of this review, essentially, now this is the key finding, and this is what I want you to really hold on to, is the findings of review highlight a systemic failure across all services to recognise and respond to children in the family environment. So it's a systemic failure. So yes, we're looking at individual practice when we're looking at those reviews, but the issues that were causing the problems in practice were systemic. Okay, I'm going to talk you through the kind of 4 themes, the 4 kind of key themes that we found. Now, what we know from research, so starting with this first one in terms of hearing children's voices, what we know from research is that most children don't tell. Okay, so the research and data, most children don't tell. However, in this sample, 75% of children had told, many of them repeatedly, but actually that they weren't believed. Now, some of them also didn't feel able to tell, and one of them was that we spoke to, who gave us the title for this report. So she said, I couldn't talk about the sexual abuse, it was too difficult. I wanted them all to notice and ask me what was going on. So within this theme, what we saw was practitioners not talking to children about sexual abuse while relying on them to tell in order to take action to protect them. So we had practitioners in round tables saying, if only they had told us what was going on, we would have been able to do something. You can't just ask children in case you ask them a leading question, which we'll think a bit more about in a bit. Not giving them the opportunities, not talking to them on their own. Not believing children when they did tell and not hearing what they said, but then absolutely hearing it if they retracted it. So many ways kind of taking the retractions more seriously than their original report of sexual abuse. Practitioners not giving children information, so not telling the children about the adults in their life who presented a risk of harm. So, for example, one young person was placed by a judge with a known offender. He had a conviction for sexual offending. He was her stepdad. She wasn't told about his conviction. Judge placed her with this guy. He went on to sexually abuse her for 6 years. When she found out that he was an offender, she said, well, if actually someone had told me about that, it might have made an opportunity for me to tell them what was going on for me. So again, this kind of not communicating with children and with families actually about information about their lives that they need to know about. Children also not having access to appropriate support, and many of us, I'm sure, will have had the experience of being told that our young person is too unstable for child and adolescent mental health support, for example. What was really interesting is that the rapid reviews were often called by the safeguarding partnerships as a result of very, very severe mental health distress. So 7 of the young people in our sample had taken their own lives. Another 14 had made serious attempts and communicated that they wanted to take their own lives. We had, I can't remember, 7 or 8 children who were pregnant. No, 11, actually, no, 11, I think, children became pregnant. 6 of them went on to give birth. So we had many, many more serious impacts than that. So these are, you know, very serious cases. So the rapid reviews were kind of called as a result of the presenting either severe mental health distress or kind of very strong sexual exploitation type stuff. And there was little mention. So you'd find one line in there saying, oh, and actually this child was previously abused in that family environment by her dad. That was it. Now, actually, what you recognise is that children need support at the time when they are when we've got the concerns about sexual abuse, whether they're giving us those reports much earlier, and that would have prevented the later abuse. Now, talking about the kind of lack of access of child and adolescent mental health services is one thing. However, it's absolutely critical that what we recognise is that specialist professional support, not only is there not much of it, but it is not the sole response to child sexual abuse, okay? Children will benefit immensely from receiving a supportive response from all of us, from any of us on this call, who can kind of reassure them of the normality of their experiences when they experience sexual abuse and support them in understanding at least that it wasn't their fault. So a bit of advice from a child on this theme is ask more direct questions and keep children informed. So on the second one, in terms of understanding parents and carers' context, vulnerabilities and needs, the kind of overriding thing within this really was this lack of understanding of the impact of domestic abuse and coercive control and how that affects a parent's ability to protect. So within that, we saw a real over-reliance on non-abusing parents to protect their children without giving them the guidance they needed in order to do it, or communicating with them in a way that they understood, either because of English as a second language or because of learning needs or because they just needed some time to get their heads around this massive thing that had happened. So within that, what we did was we relied on them to supervise contact, often in, you know, violent situations. We had really inappropriate written agreements. So, for example, a 7-month pregnant mum was asked to sign a written agreement that she would keep her children safe by sleeping across one of their bedroom doors to stop the other one getting in there. A real theme of not believing parents, particularly within those cases that were in the court arena. So, for example, where mothers in particular are saying, actually, my child has told me that they've been sexually abused, or the child has reported it, them then being kind of deemed as having parental alienation syndrome, judges then placing children with the person who the allegation had been made against, and then going on to be sexually abused, sometimes for years. So we saw that heavily. A real lack of support for parents in terms of substance misuse or mental health, and just how to support and protect their child when they'd been sexually abused in the family. So the advice from a parent on one of these was work with parents by listening to their views more and support them. So number 3, around challenges in identifying signs, identifying and risks. Now, remember what I'd said about this is a systemic failure. So actually the context here in terms of this real lack of understanding of the signs and indicators of child sexual abuse is the context of a lack of training and of resources, emotionally difficult work, and actually a kind of good supervision. So we also have managers who haven't learned about child sexual abuse, then supervising social workers, and actually it's a tricky area, okay? So people lacked an understanding of what the signs and indicators were, seeking other explanations for things to kind of work out what's happened. Signs of sexual abuse in disabled children very frequently missed and seen as being as a result of their diagnosed condition, while equally children being diagnosed with conditions that were actually not a diagnosis, but was as a result of them being sexually abused. Now, the kind of issues in identifying signs and indicators in children was also kind of fed into identifying signs and indicators in the adults around them. So indicators of abusive behaviour, a real lack of understanding of the grooming process and how that might present, stereotypes and assumptions about both victims and those who harm, actually. And that fed into a really poor quality assessment of risk. So a third of these families that we looked at had a known history. So a third of the kind of people who abuse children had a known history of sexual offending or some kind of risk of sexual harm. But practitioners had lacked the knowledge and resources to identify what that risk meant. So we had convicted people moving in with no risk assessments, less recent concerns not being seen as relevant or significant, police not sufficiently probing, concerns being raised by family members not being listened to, very limited analytical thinking in terms of online, offline risk crossover, probation not being invited to strategy meetings, real confusion on different risk assessments of different agencies, weak assessments of kinship care, so children being placed with grandparents, for example, where their own parent may have made a disclosure of sexual abuse against a grandparent, but because no further action was taken, we just didn't think about it and place those children there. Children and family assessments kind of tended to lack depth, kind of didn't focus on the sexual abuse, kind of focused on the other areas that were identified, lack of kind of chronology. Another thing with sexual abuse is signs and indicators build over time, so the importance of a chronology is high, and what we saw that wasn't really happening in practice. So advice from a child in this end of this area was to be more attuned to children's mental health and the reasons behind these. So finally, then, issues in responding to concerns. The biggest thing in here was around inappropriate evidential thresholds. So believing that the criminal standard of proof of beyond reasonable doubt is needed to take action rather than of safeguarding a standard of proof of the balance of probabilities. And we're going to talk more about that in a bit. Also, where there's no verbal report, no safeguarding action being taken. People saying, how can we record it if we don't have the evidence? So the system was becoming, basically what we saw is that the system becomes completely paralysed when the police take no further action. And I'm going to talk more about that, so I won't talk about that any further now. So these were the recommendations, there's 10 recommendations, and I know that the reports have been posted in the chat and all of those recommendations are there, so I'm not going to go through them in entirety because I'm conscious of time. But just to say, bearing in mind we've had all these previous reports, what we haven't had is a national strategic government action plan. So number one is we want the government, and we're waiting for the government to respond on these recommendations. We hope it's going to be in the next few weeks. But what we're hoping is that they will have a national action plan where they bring together, because sexual abuse affects all areas of a child's development, and therefore all government departments have a role to play. So we're hoping that that will provide the overarching structure for the rest of the recommendations. Number two, which is the one that is this one and another one of the most exciting recommendations, but actually that the government need to ensure that professionals have the training to do this. I mean, this has taken a long time trying to get this on the agenda, so fingers crossed this goes through. I'm going to focus more on inquiries and investigations. You'll see that the kind of bottom three, so family courts, CAFCAS and the inspectorates, very key players in this world, have also got recommendations that we hope will form parts of the puzzle. We know how influential judges' decision-making are in the family courts, and so there absolutely has to be some movement there. We know that. Okay. Now, what was great is that even though the government haven't responded yet, what the report was very clear about was safeguarding partners should crack on and do these recommendations. So these fall out of the bigger recommendations. What was fascinating is, I mean, I had the joyous job of reading Working Together from cover to cover, but what was really interesting is actually we don't need to change any legislation, because it all exists and we can do it. And the guidance is there, it's not filtering down to practice. So on that basis, what the chair of the panel said is actually safeguarding partners, crack on and do these things. So that's very positive. And if you don't think your authority is getting on and doing with it, please give them a nudge. So when child sexual abuse elicits really strong emotional responses from everyone who comes into contact with it. As a result, the way that society and us as professionals have dealt with sexual abuse has often been very reactive. So if we go right back to kind of Freud at the beginning of the 19th century, who was psychoanalyzing middle-class Austrian young women, those Austrian young women were disclosing abuse by their fathers. This hit the kind of press at the time. And the society said, no way, there is no way that all these young women are being sexually abused by their fathers. And Freud said, do you know what? You might be right. I think this might be fantasy. Therein sowing the seed, how we often think about child sexual abuse, that this is something that is fantasized about, that is made up, that this isn't reality, all that kind of stuff. It fed into the later movement around False Memory Syndrome Society, which was set up by a man who had a conviction against a young boy and whose daughter made allegations against him, and he set up the False Memory Syndrome Society, which had no scientific basis, gained loads of traction across the world, actually. Anyway, that has just disbanded a couple of years ago, which is positive. So there's Freud then, and then we think about Cleveland. So this was a big event that happened at the end of the 80s in the borough of Cleveland. 121 children were thought to have been mistakenly removed from their families as a result of child sexual abuse. There was massive media outcry. Parents on breakfast television saying, "Please come home to me, my child. These evil social workers have taken you away." And actually, as a result, those children were returned home. What we saw 10 years later was a report identified that actually in the majority of those cases, there was a strong evidence of sexual abuse, but actually, as a result of our reaction, we hadn't protected those children. The messages of Cleveland, the myths of Cleveland, still emanate through practice today. So we still have judges saying things like, "Beware the lessons of Cleveland," and they are not talking about the lessons of Cleveland are not the lessons of Cleveland. The lessons of Cleveland are not, "Don't help children to tell." It was the lessons of Cleveland were other things, but certainly not that. So that has really dominated practice. One of the biggest problems is that prior to Cleveland, as a social worker, you absolutely would have learned about sexual abuse, particularly within the family environment. One of the 4 things we register on would have been covered, and then it just fell off university teaching agendas until we've ended up with the situation we have now, where there is no expectation across any social work programs that they learn about child sexual abuse. So unless there is a tutor at university who has a particular interest in it, students won't get that kind of input, which is just not acceptable, because without the formal education on sexual abuse, this becomes what teaches us. So we therefore learn what the rest of the public learn, and we are learning from the media about what sexual abuse is, and you can't not be impacted by these stereotypes. So what we read about is sexual abuse is perpetrated by people out there, people who are different to us. They're pervs, pedos, monsters, freaks. And actually, first and foremost, these people are human beings. And if we are busy looking for somebody who looks like a monster or looks in a certain way or is from a certain community, then we are going to miss where the sexual abuse is happening. Actually, we can't tell by looking, but it's very hard to kind of shift that strong media thing. What we know is that, when you think of people being monstrous and evil and freakish and all of these things, then it's very hard to imagine them being good with children. And so when we work with a family where they are good with children, we can't equate the two. Also, if children say that they want to keep seeing this parent, we think, "Oh, that's odd. If they were abusing them, then they must want to, they can't have been abusing them." And actually, that's not true. What we're not doing is applying what we know about sexual abuse, in that actually, the way children are sexually abused is through touch and attention and time and play and positive encouragement. I mean, also all the horrid stuff that comes with that. But actually, what children usually want is for the abuse to stop, but they don't want to lose that person, because often that person, in my experience of working with families, it was often the person abusing the child who was the best parent in that house. So it's complex. But what we need to do is kind of have more of an understanding. So in the national panel findings, what we're seeing is people don't understand that kind of grooming and who offenders are, because you haven't been taught it, because we haven't been taught it. And that's what we need to change. So what we see then is practice is very governed by fear. So what if I get it wrong? It's like the hardest thing to accuse someone of sexual abuse, harder than accusing someone of murder, probably. What if I'm wrong? What if I'm wrong? What if I'm wrong? So meantime, we gather all the evidence that we are indeed wrong. And so, for example, 7-year-old boy masturbating all over the place. Then we find out he's on the autistic spectrum. We're all like, "Oh, it's actually autism, not sexual abuse." Rather than holding in mind it could be either of those things. And that's what we do. The other problem is, much better for us in practice, and any practice educators on the call, actually just switch that around. Not what if I'm wrong, but what if I'm right? What if this child is being sexually abused? And what should I do in my role to make them safer or to support them? The other thing that we do is we think everyone else is, that there must be someone else who's an expert. We as social workers are the experts, okay? We work with people through all sorts of difficult things and difficult experiences, and sexual abuse is no different. We do not need additional skills than what we've already got in order to work with these children and families and adults, okay? You look at we think, "Oh, well, if I refer to CAMHS, they'll be able to do it." CAMHS are thinking, "Well, we're not the experts." Adult mental health are thinking, "We're not the experts." Everybody is thinking they're not the experts, and we are the experts. We just need to learn a little bit about, and this is what I mean about the, wanting to get sexual abuse on the teaching agenda for social work means that we can do there's so many things we can do that are relatively simple to make a massive difference. And although it feels complex, it's pretty textbook. So we just need to learn some of that, and we can make such a big difference, But first and foremost, to recognise that we have the skills to do this stuff. Probably one of the biggest barriers is around the fear of contaminating evidence, okay? So all of the research with children, young people and adults says we need help to tell. all of the professionals are terrified to ask for this fear of asking a leading question, which nowhere is a description of a leading question, by the way, but we've got this absolute fear. Now, this is particularly interesting because actually what we see from the data is that so the dark blue line across the bottom is the number of cases that are charged by the police. So on average, this is about 11%. So on average, 1 in 10 cases of child sexual abuse are further actioned by police. So that's 9 out of 10 cases that are not further actioned by police. So we are massively consumed with the fear of contaminating evidence to the point that we don't talk to children, don't ask them when we're worried about them. When they tell us, we freeze. We think, I can't, someone else needs to be there, or I need to or we ask them repeatedly to tell us because we're so scared of contaminating the evidence. In the 1 out of 10 cases that are going to be further action by police, of which around about half are going to end up going to court, it's a disproportionate fear. And actually what we're doing is and then what we do is we if the police take further action, it wouldn't be such a problem actually if the police took no further action, if social care then said, well, okay, the police can't take further action because what they need is evidence beyond reasonable doubt. Their legal framework is the one on the left, beyond reasonable doubt. Our legal framework is a balance of probabilities, okay? So if the police take no further action because they can't, because it's beyond reasonable doubt, it's no good for us to say, well, there's nothing we can do because the police are taking no further action. Because actually, on the balance of probabilities, you have a child who may or may not have been able to say what's happened to them. There are strong signs and indicators. We've done a bit of an assessment and we can see there are these other concerns. On the balance of probability, it's happened. So on the balance of probabilities, we need to carry on working with this child. And some of the panel recommendations address this, which I'm excited about. So essentially, when that NFA decision happens, either by police or Crown Prosecution Service, these are what people think, there's nothing we can do. There's no evidence the child's been sexually abused. Worst case scenario, the child must have made this up. I can't say I believe them. So schools or whoever's referred in are thinking, well, what do I do? The police have taken no further action. So can I even say it to the child? What do I do? There's no evidence this child was previously abused. So this kind of thing of when we've got young people in care and we're looking at their records and there was an NFA decision however long ago, well, it was NFA'd, so we won't worry about that. We won't tell the foster carers there's been sexually abused because actually it was NFA'd, so there was no proof, there was no evidence. We also think we can't, if we don't do anything, if we close the case at the point of no further action, we can't then refer for specialist help. This kind of idea, the family won't work with us now because we haven't got the evidence to make them. On the balance of probabilities, we absolutely have. So recommendation 3, my goodness, my slide's quite small here. And this is kind of one of the recommendations that is very pleasing, and Safeguarding Partnership have also been asked to take this forward now. We've asked partners to audit and review local guidance. So there is a very clear distinction made between the thresholds of significant harm and criminal proof, so that we very clearly understand that we need to be responding on the thresholds of significant harm. At the end of a Section 47 inquiry, that there must be a multi-agency discussion where the agencies come back around the table and say, okay, so police have not taken further action. What do we need to do now to support and protect this child? We are calling for a move away from no further action because of the power of that statement. And what we want is from now on people to use no further police action at this time. Number 1, the message to the child. Actually, we're not able to take police action now and to the family, but we are going to be taking other action, and it's not that we don't believe you. And the message to the person who's caused that harm, don't think that this has gone away. Because at the moment, as soon as no further action decision happens, the abuser is free to abuse more. That's because we do nothing else with them. We're also saying that there should be a very clear record of why a criminal investigation has been closed, because other agencies also don't understand why things have been closed. And so rather than just saying no further action, we say, actually, the police could take no further action at this time because, and there are a number of reasons that you can then be putting in that. But that's in the children's file then, when children look at them and they see that they're believed, other agencies can believe those children. 1 in 10 child gets further action by the police. So we've got to think about the other 9 out of 10. And when this concept of evidence, when you think about evidence, it's rarely clear cut when it comes to sexual abuse. So how do we absolutely know? A child needs to tell us at least twice. So first they tell somebody that they trust, then they have to tell 2 people like police officer, social worker that can do all the things the abuser's told them that's going to happen. It's amazing if they repeat that report. Then they have to kind of do a Q&A. Then they have to give an achieving best evidence video. If at any point during their memory has changed because their children and memories changed, they're not good witnesses and we're out of the picture. So very rare. Medical evidence of sexual harm, very rare. There's probably some of you that have ever had a report back from paediatricians saying there's evidence, but essentially the younger the child, the quicker they heal. Sexual abuse, it doesn't always cause physical harm. Children take time to tell people, so actually those injuries may have gone. Admission of guilt from someone who's harmed, very rare. Being witnessed by somebody else, very rare, particularly with intrafamilial child sexual abuse. Sometimes it could be that a sibling is seen, but often the legal people will say that there was collusion between them. Images or computer records being fined, so there's a slight increase in this, but what we can forget to do as social workers and police is ask, and was technology used? Were there any photos taken, to try and improve that evidence? Essentially, rarely will we reach a position of absolute knowing. And yet what we do and what managers say is, well, where's your evidence? Have you got the evidence? No, of course we haven't got the evidence beyond reasonable doubt. It is highly unlikely we'll have evidence beyond reasonable doubt, but we do have evidence of concern on the balance of probabilities. And what we actually need to do is build a picture. So what the signs and indicators in children, in those around the child, and of the vulnerabilities in the child's environment. Very briefly, this is the template that we've created to support you to do that. I'm not going to spend time on it. It's going to go in the chat and you can have a play afterwards. But essentially what this template does is helps you look at all those kind of areas to build your picture. Children are much, much more likely to show us rather than tell us what's going on for them. As we all, we all are. It's hard to talk about difficult things, but actually we may be walking around looking sad about it or feeling sad about it. So recommendation here, recommendation 3, this is the last bit of the other ones I just went through. Safeguarding decisions must be based on all indicators of sexual abuse and should not rely solely on verbal statements from children. Pretty amazing to have that in this report and spelled out so clearly. What we know from the previous report, so the JTI intrafamilial, was that professionals rely far too heavily on children to verbally disclose, which is crazy when we look at what we know about children talking. So actually 82% of boys, 78% of girls didn't tell anyone at the time. So again, this is adults reporting as children. They didn't tell anyone at the time. And yet we are totally relying on them to do not only to kind of identify they're being abused, find someone to talk to and then tell them. Unrealistic responsibility. What we have devised, another resource here, is communicating with children. So what this resource does is tell you what you can and can't say to children, what you should be saying to help them tell, the barriers to telling, talks about all different contexts. We're about to publish an updated version, which is more accessible, more helpful for people working with non-verbal children as well. So keep your eye out for that. And this is kind of our favourite recommendation. I've got 2. So the professional bodies one, which we'll talk about in a second, but the recommendation talking to children. So this is in writing in a government report. Government should ensure that practitioners understand they can and should talk directly to children and families about concerns of sexual abuse. So this feels, radical in terms of kind of not radical. If you see what I mean, when you look at it, it's not radical, but very, very pleasing to have it in a report. So if every time you're kind of thinking, should I talk directly? There is guidance to do that. And so one of the other things is in terms of how do we then teach people around this? So what does all this mean for social work education? So the recommendation 2, which is the other great recommendation. So government should take the necessary steps working with professional bodies to ensure that practitioners and managers have and practice educators, I would say, have the necessary skills, knowledge and capabilities, including access to relevant guidance and multi-agency training. This should include reviewing and updating initial training, early career and ongoing professional development and supervision, so that practitioners can fulfil their roles and responsibilities in identifying and responding to child sexual abuse and offending. And this will ensure that relevant resources and guidance are widely available. So this is the bit, soon I'm very much hoping the government go with this one, and then mission on to get sexual abuse kind of on the agenda for social work and all other agencies, by the way. We're not in this on our own, are we? We need everyone on the right page. Very briefly, one of the things that we talked about, and I'll talk briefly about this. So in the panel report, we talk about taking a kind of spectrum approach. So when we think about child sexual abuse, so when we think about the data, 1 in 10 being children being sexually abused, and that's general population. If you think about the children we work with, where there's disability or neglect or substance misuse, those numbers are going to be much higher, right? So when we hear about the data, it feels quite overwhelming. And when we think about sexual abuse, we think about it always as being horrifying. Now, if it's always horrifying, then it must need the best expert in the world. So if there's loads of it, and if it needs the best expert, then actually we can't do that. And I think there is a shutdown process that then happens. And then the 1 in 10 further actioning kind of fits well with that, because we don't have to worry about the 9 out of 10. Actually, what we need to think about this isn't something that sits, yes, of course, there will be a need for specialist therapeutic input. And there will be some children, sexual abuse happens on the spectrum. There are some children who sit here and have been touched over clothes once or twice by someone they don't know, to someone who has been chronically sexually abused over a number of years. Okay. So of course, all people are affected differently and to different degrees, but all of us have a role in responding to those children. If at the very least, every practitioner that children came across where they've been sexually abused was able to say, you do know this wasn't your fault, we would be doing a million times better than we are now. So what we really want is for right across the board, across this spectrum, we want people to know what they can and can't do within their roles and what resources they need to do that, so that we are responding to children at the time that they are reporting that they're being sexually abused, that whether or not police are taking further action, we are able to say, this isn't your fault, this isn't your responsibility, and this is what we can do. This is all of our job, because actually the preventative work that we could do would be incredible in terms of short and long-term mental health, parenting capacity later on, criminal behaviour, harmful sexual behaviour, later sexual offending. 5 out of the people we spoke to who had offended against their children in our sample, 3 of them had previously experienced sexual abuse. Now, there isn't a causal link. There is sometimes. Just because you've been sexually abused does not mean you're going to go on to sexual abuse. That's very important. But for these 3 that had played into it, none of them had ever been spoken to at the time of their own abuse as children or since about what had happened. How much harm could we prevent actually if we responded to the children at the time and helped them process what was going on for them? Okay, so these are the kind of key things that came from the report, and I know from practice from years. So the key things that we need to be teaching: signs and indicators, talking to children, the legal threshold stuff, about the impact of abuse. Sometimes people think that this isn't important for adult social workers, and it massively is important for adult social workers. Also how to support families and how to manage risk. So some of the ideas that we've had and we've been trying to do for a number of years, but I would really, anyone who wants to anyone who's on the call who would like to join the kind of movement to try and get this change, please do get in touch with me. But I get that social work programs are rammed busy. Okay, so it might not be that social work programs can slot in enough of time on child sexual abuse. However, if across all of the different modules in social work we had case studies on child sexual abuse, we'd be naming it, we'd be introducing it. So on your legal module, for example, there's a case study that includes sexual abuse on there. And when you're doing your kind of mental health bit or all the rest of it, so it's about really thinking, how do we incorporate this across the board, making sure that we have resources on reading lists, that we have a free e-learning course that's a 90-minute e-learning course. It's free. So could universities be asking students to do that? Could partnerships be saying, when people join authorities, mandatory, you have to just complete this kind of course? Easily done, really easily done, and really helpful. I think that sometimes people panic that because there's so much of it, and there might be so much of it, and if we start asking, then there'll be loads of it. We're already working with these children in different areas. They're presenting to us with self-harm or with behavioural issues or sexual exploitation. They're presenting to us anyway. So we need to just get this sorted, really. So kind of thinking about content across models, giving input to practice educators. So are there forums of practice educators where we could actually be doing some training with them so that they can think about how they can be supported? We've got resources around supervising this stuff as well. And then post-qualifying, simple. So we need to get it sorted out so that in the pre-qualifying space, we've got some of this training, and then in the post-qualifying, embedding some of this training, having a bit of a training framework. What do people need to know at each level? A very clear training offer, resource hubs where resources can sit and be accessible to people, and supervision. So, and also making sure that we do varied methods of learning and development, so not all just delivery like this. What we want, so children, young people and adult survivors want us to have hope. There is a spectrum of experiences, and with the right input, people can and do recover from the harm they've experienced and go on to live positive lives. Young people with harmful sexual behaviour don't go on to abuse as adults with the right support. Even adult offenders can that's the lowest level of reconviction actually with adult offenders. So we can do a lot. We absolutely need to break this silence. We need to talk to children when we're worried about them, when we know something's happened to them. We need to talk to other professionals. We need to talk to family members. We need to really communicate well, and we need to get some knowledge. So today's been a start and probably a refresher for some, but let's really think together, how can we make sure that social workers primarily have some input, at least some input, in terms of child sexual abuse? Together, we have collective strength. So radical social worker Sarah Nelson, who I love, remember there are always far more people who want to protect children than those who want to abuse them, and we should use and be heartened by the great potential in collective strength. We can do this together. We can really do it. I think there's already been a post in the chat in terms of a get support thing. So we have an option on our website where you can get support. You might want to screenshot this now if you've been affected. Also, if you're worried about your own thoughts and behaviours, and the Stop It Now helpline is a very good place to go. And please do sign up for a newsletter, so we won't bombard your inboxes at all, but when the resources come out, which just remind you are all free, you'll get them directly to your inbox.
I just want to say, first of all, thank you very much for that presentation. That was so comprehensive, and you managed to put across some really sensitive information in such a helpful way. I'm going to try and just put in one question, if that's okay. And apologies if we're not able to address all the questions today, but so I'll zone in on one that really stands out, which is, in this difficult area of work, what more can employers do to support professionals in terms of professional trauma?
Really excellent question. So one of the things, we know that the numbers are so high, right? So we can absolutely guarantee that there will be a significant proportion of our workforce that experiences sexual abuse. And what we see is that kind of line managers don't mention it. People who have experienced abuse feel like they're very judged. So if they do tell, then they're not sort of seen as professionals. What we've done within our, what we need is for kind of the whole system to be much more open about this, and to be saying, if this is an issue for you, these are the resources we have available. So making sure that those kind of links to sites, naming it. So I was, as a kind of manager and supervisor, I now always advocate, if you're working with, when you have a new member of staff or you're a practice educator, ask that question. They can choose not to say anything. Do you know what I mean? But you can say, you know what, if you did want to say something, or if something's going to be affecting your work, just let me know and we'll work out what support needs to go in there for you. It's about naming it as much with other people as it is with us, you know, I think.
Thank you, Anna. I think that was a really, that's probably the best place to end now. We could listen more to you, but unfortunately that's as much time as we can give today. But thank you so much again, and thank you to everybody who's attended this morning.